Hello, this is Music Tech Help Guy. Welcome to the fourth and final part of my video series on the ES2 synthesizer in Logic Pro 9. In this part of the series, we'll be taking a look at the vector envelope, the XY pad, the randomization features, as well as the macro controls down here on the bottom. So let's start with the vector envelope. Now, in the previous part, we discussed how to use the LFOs and the envelopes with our modulation routers here. Now, one quick thing to keep in mind is that not only can your source for modulation be an envelope or an LFO, it can be a number of things, but it could also be pad X or pad Y. So what do these refer to? Well, what this means, right now I have pitch 1 being controlled by pad X. What that means is that the pitch of our first oscillator, let's just make it pitch 1, 2, 3, the pitch of all three oscillators is being directly controlled by the position of this little node here on the x-axis of the XY pad. So if I play a note, I can directly control that pitch by moving this on the x-axis. Now, the y-axis isn't going to do anything, but the x-axis will. So you can actually set up two different parameters on the XY pad, one for pad X, one for pad Y, and you can control these two factors by moving this little node around. Now, this is fully automatable as well. If you turn on automation in the Arrange window, and you turn on one of your live automation modes like touch or latch or write, you can actually write the X and Y axis positions in your session. So how do these relate to the vector mode? Well, let's go ahead and turn these routers off. And let's click on the vector tab here. And what vector mode does, or what the vector envelope does, is it's a special type of envelope that allows for repeating modulation effects. Now, as we discussed in the previous video, typically LFOs create repeating effects, up and down, increasing, decreasing effects like vibrato, tremolo, trills, and other things like that. With envelopes, at least with the traditional envelopes, you have an attack, a decay, sustain, and release. And so you can only create effects that rise and then fall, and then a release. So they only happen once. They don't repeat themselves. So the vector envelope, this thing right here, is a special type of envelope that allows us to create looped patterns, forward and reverse patterns, and also synchronized modulation patterns that synchronize to the tempo of our project as well. Now, before we get into this, below the little vector tab, there's a menu that says vector mode off. And when you click on that, there are four modes. There's off, mix, XY, and mix XY. With mix on, what this means is that the vector envelope is going to be controlling the position of the balance of the three oscillators. Now, one thing I should mention is that with the vector envelope, instead of having a traditional A, D, S, and R stages, you can basically have not as many stages as you want, but multiple stages. And each one of these little nodes here on the envelope represents a different stage. And as you can see, as I click on stage 1, the mix parameter is here, but in stage 2, it's here. Stage 3, it's here. And stage 4, it's here. What would happen now is if I press a key on my MIDI controller, is this parameter is essentially just going to be automated across time to repeat and move through that pattern. And so here we would be automating mix, the mix of the three oscillators. Now, that's just for vector mode mix. For vector mode XY, we'd be controlling this parameter across time. So on stage 1, we're here. Stage 2, we're here. Stage 3, it's in the middle. Stage 4, we're there. And so we could automate some parameter left and right and up and down on the XY pad. And then the last vector mode is mix and XY, which automates both of them across time. So that's just a little introduction to the vector modes. Let's talk about how to set up the XY and set up the mix triangle to work with the vector envelope. So right now what we have is 1, 2, 3, 4 stages. And what the milliseconds in between represent is the amount of time it takes to get from number 1 to number 2. So as you can see on number 1, we have the mix here, the XY here, and at number 2, the mix is here and the XY is here. So it's going to take 1,500 milliseconds to move from this to this. So what we're going to hear is a slow transition from one point to the next. Now, 1,500 milliseconds is 1.5 seconds, and so 1,497 milliseconds is also roughly 1.5 seconds. And then when we get to step 3, stage 3, I should say, there's a little S above it, and that S represents the sustain. So much like our envelopes down here on the bottom, we have a sustain stage, and the sustain stage represents the point where you are holding the key down and the envelope will not go any further until you release the key. Then when you release the key, you can choose to make the envelope follow through to the 4th stage or whatever you want it to be. By the way, the sustain can be moved by simply clicking above each little stage but below the number, and you can say I want the sustain to be on stage 4 rather than on stage 3. So let's go ahead and put it on stage 4. In addition to what we're doing now, we also have to choose, because I mean the triangle is controlling the volume of the 3 oscillators. We already know that, but the XY pad has to be set up. We have to tell the ES2 what is on the x-axis and what is on the y-axis. And so the way we would do that is right here where it says X target, Y target, we choose 2 different targets for modulation. This is not so unlike the modulation routers that we had used before. The source is the X and Y, but the target's going to be something and something. So in vector mode, we're going to say, let's make the X target amplitude, and let's make the Y target our filter 2's cutoff. By the way, if we have to turn the filter on for this to work. I'm going to pull the blend all the way down to filter 2 since that's the one we're using. So again, amplitude or amplifier, whichever way you want to see it, is just going to be volume, and then the cutoff 2 is going to be this knob right here. In addition to choosing the target, we have to choose the intensity. That's what INT is. And essentially, that's the depth of the modulation. It's the same as the little green triangle we saw earlier when we were setting up modulation to modulation router. So the intensity can be anywhere from 1 to -1 or to 0, which is no intensity. You're not going to hear anything. Let's put these all the way up to 1. And if you just double click, you can type in what you want it to be. And actually for amplitude, let's make this 0.6. Yeah, that works. All right. The next thing we need to do is we need to set a position for our XY pad and our triangle for each one of these points, each of these stages in our vector envelope. One way we can hear how each stage is going to sound is to click this solo point button. Now, if you just leave this off, you're actually going to hear the entire envelope through as you hold the key down with the amplitude and cutoff changes. So let's see what this sounds like right now. And it's actually, we don't know how to set this up yet, but what's happening right now is it's going from number 1 all the way to number 4, and then going in reverse back to number 1, and then going forward to number 4, and then back to number 1, and this repeating back and forth pattern. The way you can change that is you can change your loop mode right here. Right now it's an alternate, which means that it goes back and forth rather than just forward or backward. And when you're in forward, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And when you go backward, it goes 4, 3, 2, 1, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so forth. When it's on off, this effect will only happen once and will just stop right here at the sustain point. And that's where it stops. You don't hear any new... right there is where it stopped, so you don't hear it going backward or forward again. So I'm going to put this on a forward loop for now. And so we've created this very basic effect, but this is like a preset that was set up in the synthesizer. Just the motion of each stage is already preset for us. Let's create our own. So the way you can do this, if you hit solo point and you click on a point, you're only going to hear the sound of that point. So we're going to hear this balance in this XY position. So we can kind of audition each point in the stage. Let's make that a little more present by pulling the mix into the middle and opening up the filter, which is our Y-axis. See how Y is controlling the filter and X is controlling the volume. Let's put that all the way up there in the corner. Number 2, let's move this down here and here. Number 3, let's go there and there. And then number 4, I'm going to turn the volume pretty low. And we'll go there. So let's see what this sounds like. And again, we're in forward loop mode, so we're basically hearing 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, one quick thing before I play this, you can actually click on your milliseconds, the duration between each stage, and you can pull this down. So let's make this a little shorter, like 470 milliseconds works. It's going to happen a little quicker. We're going to turn off solo point so we hear the whole envelope. So we're getting this pretty, not really that complex effect, but we're getting something that's a little different than what like an LFO could produce in a repeating pattern. Now, what if I want more stages than just the 4 that I'm given here? One thing you can do is you can right-click on the envelope, and you can say, insert point to the right of selected point. So what you can do is select a point. You can say, I want an extra point in between 2 and 3. You right-click and say, insert point to the right of selected point. So now I have 470 between 1 and 2, but 240 and 235 between 2 and 4. But now I have 5 stages instead of 4 stages. And you can further create a different sound and further complicate what we have. So that sound is changing between 5 different places, positions, and what we have here. Now, another thing we can do is we have this envelope mode down here, and right now it's set to normal, but there's also finish mode. What normal mode does is if your volume envelope number 3, which we said was hardwired to volume, has a high release time, meaning that when you release the key, the sound is going to last beyond when you release the key for quite a while. On normal mode, watch what happens. I just released the key. See how it just stops? The motion stops. So basically, the envelope turns off in normal mode after you release the key. What if you want the envelope to continue on even after you release the key? Well, that's where finish mode comes into play. If I press the key and then release the key, even if my volume envelope is still lingering around, the envelope will still play through until the sound dies down to nothing. I just released the key. So the envelope will repeat itself until the sound dies down to nothing. Another thing we can do is if you're using a loop mode, you can choose the loop amount. Right now it's set to infinite, which means that if I hold the key down, it's going to continue to loop this over and over and over and over again. You can actually, if you click and drag up or down, you can choose between a minimum loop count of 1 or you can put up to 10. And so you can signify a certain number of loops that you want and then have it stop. So like with a loop count of 3, here's what it sounds like. And so after that third loop, you don't have the envelope repeating itself anymore. All right, so let's put that back on infinite. Another thing that we can adjust is the curve. And the curve basically just controls the motion of the movement on the XY pad or the triangle. There's linear, there's several convex shapes, and several concave shapes. With convex, what's going to happen is if you have a position here and a position here, the sound is going to kind of scoop around to the next point. With concave, concave, it's going to scoop under to get to the next point, kind of like an exponential motion or a logarithmic motion, whereas linear is going to go directly to the next point. Now, there's also, at the bottom here, hold and step, which means that the sound's going to start here and then immediately go to here, then immediately go to here, then immediately go to here. So with hold and step, as we'll find in just a few moments here, you can create some cool kind of stuttering effects with this. So with hold and step, we get something like this. There's no transition between each step and the next step. It just goes from one step to the next. All right. One quick thing I want to show you before we get out of the vector envelope, because there's a couple other things we haven't talked about, is if you right-click on the envelope, one of the options that we can choose, obviously we can clear the envelope to start from scratch. We can actually copy an envelope and copy it over to another ES2 if we want to. But we can also right-click and choose Initialize to 8/8 loop or Initialize to 16/16 loop. Now, what that means is you can initialize the envelope to have 8 steps and 8 eighth note steps, meaning that in the measure of 4/4 time, which you normally have 4 quarter notes, you can initialize this to 8 eighth notes. So you'll get an eighth note rhythmic effect. You can create stutter effects that are timed effects rather than being represented in milliseconds as we had before. You can also have initialized to 16/16 loop, which will create 16 steps, 16/16 notes in a measure of 4/4 time. So if we choose initialize to 8/8, watch what happens. Instead of getting milliseconds, we get percentage. So we basically have 8 steps in a measure of 4/4 time, each making up 12.5% of the loop. Now, I know that seems a little confusing because you'd think, well, if these are eighth notes, they should all make up 1/8 of the total time, which 1/8, 1/8 is 12.5% because 25%, it would be a quarter, so you split that in half, you get an eighth. So each step is equal to 1/8 of a measure of 4/4 time. So the cool thing here is that this loop is now synchronized to one measure of 4/4 time. So every time you hold the key down, you're hearing 4 beats of 4/4 time over and over and over and over again. And if you change the tempo of your project, the envelope will speed up or slow down. You can actually do this manually rather than doing the right-click thing, simply by changing your loop rate to some synced value on the left side here between 32 bars and I think it's a 64th note, basically, 64th note triplet, or to a hertz rate. So let's go back to 1/1 or 1 bar, which is one measure of music. And let's go to solo point mode, and let's choose 8 different positions on the XY pad and the triangle pad. So let's start here. Let's go like that. Let's move that there. And I'm just picking this at random. Sometimes you can create some pretty cool effects just by picking at random and then tweaking what you have rather than thinking too hard about every single position you are selecting. Let's turn solo point off, and let's see what we got here. So it's kind of a cool little groove. Let's go ahead and put this on finish mode. Let's see if I can play some chords with this and see what this sounds like. So you can create some cool stuttering and synchronized effects with this. Now, the one of the downsides to using the vector envelope is, unlike LFO2 and unlike envelope number 1, which can be set to monophonic mode, it's purely a polyphonic envelope. So every note you play has its own vector envelope that it's referencing. So if you play two notes even slightly off, as you heard in the previous recording, they have their own envelope, and so all the notes that you play will not necessarily synchronize to the same motion unless you can perfectly play them in time. So that's just a little bit on using that. Now, one last thing I want to show you is the loop smoothing option. Essentially, what loop smoothing does is it lengthens the final stage of the envelope. As you can see, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 segments. And right now, each segment is 12.5%. Now, as you know, as we said earlier, 12.5% times 8 is 100%. 12.5 times 7 is, it's like 87.5%. So we're missing an extra segment after this 8th step back here. So what loop smoothing does is it determines the amount of time after, or not, I don't say after, but the amount of time that the 8th step is held for before repeating back to the first step. So in an 8/8 loop, you want this to be 12.5, otherwise your groove is going to get offset. But if you bump it up, you'll notice that each stage gets shorter, but the final stage, the 8th stage, will end up being longer than all the others, and it will be held out longer than the others. So typically, just trust the preset, trust the initialized 8/8 loop option, because it's going to set you up for a loop that musically and rhythmically makes sense. All right. That's the vector envelope in a nutshell. Probably one of the most useful hidden little gems in the ES2 if you can figure out how to use it and figure out how to create some cool sounds with it. Okay, a couple last things I want to cover before we wrap up the video. One thing I didn't show you in the previous videos is this little RND button down here. Now what this does is it initializes the entire synthesizer by a random effect. Now, right now, this little menu says all, which means that every single knob, every single fader, every single option we have here will be randomized by a certain factor when I click this button. With the fader all the way down, it means it's going to randomize everything by 1%. So if I click on this button, you notice there's very little, if no movement in some places. As you bump this up, say 50%, every time I click on the R&D button, every single knob or fader is going to be randomized by a factor of 50%. If you bump this up to 100%, it's basically absolute randomization. Now, the only issue with this is that there's not a whole lot of, you're not going to get a whole lot of musically useful sounds out of this. It's kind of cool to just sit here and click random until you find something that's kind of cool to work with. So if you're trying to find special effects, or you're just trying to, kind of dink around until you find something, you'll probably spend a lot of time doing that before you find something musically useful, because, as I said in the previous video, there's not a whole lot of need for using all 10 routers. And a lot of these random effects, all 10 of them or close to 10 of them are used, which are probably going to result in some not so musically sounding sounds. Another thing you can do to kind of tame the randomization effect is to choose just exactly what you want to be randomized. For example, let me go back to my original preset I had here. There we go. If we go into the vector envelope, one of the things that we can randomize is the vector envelope itself. And so if we want to, we can randomize just those features. Nothing else is being affected except for the triangle, the XY pad, and then the parameters within the vector pad. So you can create a number of effects there by randomizing the vector envelope. And you can randomize your LFOs, your waveforms, your oscillator waveforms, the filters, your envelopes, a whole bunch of other things. So that's the randomization feature. Now, the very last thing I want to show you is the macro controls down here on the bottom. What the macro controls do is and first I'm just going to pick a random effect. There we go. Turn the filter on as well. One of the things we can do down here with macros, we can control multiple parameters with a single knob. So detune controls the sense tuning of each oscillator and the analog knob up here. The wave option randomizes your waveforms, and if these are on one of the standard waveforms, not on the digiwaves, it'll move them around at random as well, or it should at least. The cutoff adjusts both cutoff frequencies, that is. And by the way, you can actually do this without using the cutoff knob. The little link in between the two cutoffs will control both of them simultaneously. Left and right controls the bottom one. Up and down controls the top one. So if you just click on the little link and drag around, you can control both cutoffs simultaneously. Resonance, same thing as before. We're controlling both resonances at the same time. You can't control both resonances with a link icon, but you can control the resonance and the cutoff frequency of a filter at the same time by clicking on the little link icon. Same goes here. Modulation accentuates or de-accentuates all of the modulation features. The attack, just all the attack times. Decay, all the decay times. Sustain, all the sustain times. Release, all the release times. And finally, volume just controls the master volume of the entire synthesizer. Now, what are these used for? What's the use of even using these? If you click on the button down here that says macro only, you'll find that you can condense the entire synthesizer down to just these 9 or was it 10 knobs. Now, the only thing I can think of that this would actually be useful for is maybe in a live situation where you want to be able to control, all of the attack times of everything all at once, or all of the modulation depths all at once. And you could assign these to 10 different knobs on your MIDI controller for a live performance. That's really the only thing I can think of, but they are there, and you can use them if you find them useful. I'll be honest with you, I don't really use them at all. And then lastly, right here at the MIDI button, you can actually set up 6 different MIDI controllers. And these MIDI controllers are, let me pull this up so you can see it a little better. I have to make the window a little smaller. There we go. You can set up your MIDI controllers, control A through F, as one of your 128 different MIDI continuous controllers. Now, if you don't know what a continuous controller is, the continuous controllers are basically 2 things. They're either continuous controllers like breath controller, foot controller, expression pedal, pan is one of them. The sustain pedal is a really common one. The modulation wheel is another really common one. So any of the other MIDI continuous controllers can also be learned, in addition to the ones that are listed in the VIA menu. Some of them are already listed, like, for instance, modulation wheel is MIDI continuous controller number 1 after touch is another one that's really common. And so they just put them in here rather than making them be assigned here. So you can actually, if you've got a headset breath controller, you can say, okay, breath controller is controller A, and I want to be able to control the depth of my vibrato, creating a vibrato effect with controller A, which is the breath controller. So as you blow into the breath controller, it's basically a microphone that you can blow into. And as you blow into the microphone, it creates a MIDI value that's higher, and you can accentuate the vibrato effect, or if you blow in less, it'll be lower. So there's a number of other MIDI controller assignments that you can set up down here as well. Again, rarely will you use all 6, even if one of them. Typically, maybe one of them you'll use, but most of the more common MIDI controller assignments or continuous controllers that are more common are going to be already assigned in the VIA window and also in the source window. As you can see, modulation wheel is there. All right, so that wraps up my video tutorial series on the ES2 synthesizer in Logic Pro. Like I said in part 1, the ES2 is one of my all-time favorite synthesizers to work with. It's got a little bit of the old, a little bit of the new, and just enough to make it interesting to use, but also easy enough for beginners to pick up on. So again, I hope you enjoyed the video series. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.